The real reason to avoid the latest Tundra, LX600, and GX550 by Lexus is pretty clear. That V35A engine that we've heard so much about, their new 3.4-liter twin-turbo V6. Yeah, that's right. If you've been an owner of one of these vehicles, chances are you've seen documentation, you've heard the rumors, but there are some updates. I want to share some of those latest findings and certainly some of the go-forward actions that Toyota and Lexus are taking care of these days. If it were me personally, I'm going to share whether I would, in fact, take a risk and buy one of these V35 powered vehicles. But before I get to that, I want to talk about where we're at today with this engine. Of course, this 3.4-liter V6 by Toyota is far from the reliability king that they once were. I mean, I personally believe, in my own take, is if you want reliable Toyota, you get yourself one of those smaller 2.5 NA engines that made it up to a hybrid drive, and then you've got yourself a reliable platform. As a matter of fact, some of their products, like, of course, the Lexus NX450H Plus is a plug-in hybrid, carries a great drive, as well as even the RAV4 Prime, great products. That's their bread and butter, and that's what people are buying. You can't get enough of. But a lot of people are looking outside that space and think, maybe I need a truck. How about a bigger SUV? Well, there was a time when a lot of those vehicles actually came with bigger engines, V8s, NAs, and they were reliable. They garnered a reputation. But since then, unfortunately, since 2022, if you happen to be an owner of a Tundra, since 2022, you'll know that's the first year of transition where they moved and dumped the old 5.7, which would literally run for 600,000 miles, and they pissed that away and said bye-bye. Instead, they decided, let's going to transition. It's all about fuel savings. It's all about efficiency. And ultimately, that meant that they were going to transplant this new redesigned 3.4 into their latest Tundra. Well, the Tundra came in at a hot little drive, and everybody touted how it performed well, how great it improved economy, and ultimately it was the best thing since sliced bread until there was failures at low mileage, at 10,000, 15, 20,000 miles. And it started out with small numbers. And then it started creeping in. We started hearing more and more and more about that rhetoric. And unfortunately, it started creeping into a lot of their other product lines. The Lexus LX600, their full-size, large-scale SUV, also utilized the same engine, started suffering the same fate. As a matter of fact, in 2022, 23, and 24, owners of either of any of those models, like the LX or even the Tundra, will know and recognize that there's a high probability it's almost like flipping a coin whether you're going to have a problem engine or not. But there's been a big problem that also accompanies an engine failure. Other than the obvious, you buy a new truck and 10,000 miles later, it blows up. The bigger problem is the wait that a lot of customers would have. It took months. It started out with analysis. They'd have to figure out, okay, did you do the maintenance on time? Are there any weasel clauses to get us out from repairing or replacing these engines? And then Toyota allegedly started out with short block replacements. Meant that a lot of times 25, 30, 40 hours were actually the time to actually have mechanics highly trained start disassembling the intakes, the turbos, intercooler, the entire top end of the engine just to try to salvage and rebuild. It started with the short blocks. Now things have changed. Toyota now has improved their process. Why? Well, here's the sad part. It's because in 2024, all of a sudden, the GX550 comes along and it was also added to this recall list of problem engines. They carried the same drivetrain, and I'll be honest, I really had my heart set on the GX550. I love the platform, 3-row SUV. I love the vehicle. It looks great. It looks utilitarian on its sort of truck platform. Everything you have and want and need in an off-road SUV is right there wrapped into one. And a lot of times people didn't want the Toyota, the old 4Runner. 4Runners were the go-to, but the problem is the 4Runners now are basically a four-banger. Most people who really consider a self-respecting off-road vehicle should all come with minimum 6-cylinder engine wouldn't even touch a 4Runner. Not because it isn't necessarily reliable, not because it isn't one of their best branding vehicles, but because it no longer carries that V6, the older 4 liters or some of the older V6s that they carried, the NA engines. Instead, now they're giving that a 4-cylinder and moving that along. And so if you want to buy a Toyota, you're going to have to effectively look at a product like we're just speaking of here, which is a true off-road excursion vehicle with a V6, but you've got to buy, of course, vehicles like the GX550 and you slide over to Lexus land, or you go full scale with the LX600. Now, the problem is, Allegedly, there's as many as 127,000 recalls associated with this engine. That's right. We're getting up there, 127,000. Next thing it keeps creeping up and up and up. And the problem with that isn't the fact that Toyota's sitting on their laurels. On the contrary, and it looks as though Toyota really trying to dig down deep and try to understand. Initially, it came out, there was conversations that sounded like, in some cases, from what I understand, and from what I've heard on the inside, is a bit of a blame game. Was there right fueling? Low fuel led to detonation, led to engine failure. Then it transitioned into, we didn't clean out, the engine properly. Upon all the machining and the interior finishing of that engine, all of a sudden, there was this assumption that this extra particulate was floating around in the engine, sort of moved around in the cooling and the oiling systems. Next thing you know, it would hang up in a bearing. See, but the problem is there seems to be inconsistencies from what I've seen and what I've researched between rod bearing failure and main bearing failure. And a lot of times, what you would expect are to see rod bearing failures, because that's often where you're going to start to see extra contaminant winds up in the oil and winds up in the bottom of the connecting rod, somewhere hanging up in the rod bearings. And that's likely where you would see a failure. The problem is, it looks as though we're seeing more main bearing failures as well, and that sort of leads the conversation down another path. Now, on one hand, what it looks like, Toyota, on one hand, is saying, look, okay, we're going to scrap the whole concept of going with the short block. It takes the techs too long to retrofit. And you know what? Ultimately, it's probably just quicker and easier, because what once was months to actually retrofit that engine, which left a lot of these customers just absolutely shaking their head and thinking, geez, when is this ever going to end? I just bought this new truck. It's got 10,000, 12, 15,000 miles on it, and now it's out of commission for the next number of months. And that's very frustrating for a lot of customers. And for me, that's the last thing I would want. I want a reliable vehicle that I've trusted. And, Toyota, truly, we've got a Camry, a 22, and we love the vehicle. I mean, from a reliability perspective, it's garnered such a reputation that it literally sells itself. The product line literally sells itself. And if you're a salesperson for Toyota, you will recognize that anybody walking in the door is likely serious and most likely going to buy a Toyota. And you don't even really have to pitch it, because people just know what they want and the reliability is there. They don't need to do a lot of research. And generally, it's been that way. Walk in, say, I want a RAV4, I want a Camry, I want a Corolla, and you're good to go. The problem is things have changed. There's been an introduction of this new 2.4 Turbo 4. Hasn't been that problematic other than more drivability issues. And of course, wastegate problems we've heard of in early generations where wastegates have failed. And it's been a bit of a pain to get some of that sorted. We've heard all kinds of little stories around that, but generally not as much the problem as we're seeing in the 3.4. Now, many would say, well, it's the same engine that we're seeing in the LS, the older outgoing LS. Well, hang on now. There's still something unique to this conversation. See, Toyota has now elected to say, look, instead of doing the short blocks, we're going to do the long blocks. We're going to swap out and do a complete long block exchange. See, because now they recognize that the customers, the consumers that own these trucks and SUVs, both in Toyota and Lexus, are getting very frustrated. Not only do they question the overall reliability history, but on top of it, now they've got to wait for months when they get that infamous fault code on the dash that says, hey, you've got a problem here. Or that weird knocking, pinging, or random shutdown, or strange noise or smoke, or just outright say, we're good, we're shutting down. See, a lot of these trucks have been a bit of a problem, and I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill, but I mean, at 127,000 vehicles included in the recall, I personally can't help but think, wait a minute, is there going to be more? Because when we think about the Toyota Sequoia, effectively, more or less, a very similar product as the Lexus LX600, is it not? Correct me if I'm wrong. So in my own personal take is, I'm going to go a step further and start to really question, is that going to have the same issue? Now, insiders, allegedly, there's folks in the brand saying that they've figured it out, they've essentially got the problem sorted, and really it should not really afflict 2026 models. They're saying basically 22, 23, 24s, are effectively the models, maybe 25s, but the problem is they're still creeping up because there's a lot of those models in the market. So they're still hearing about the issues, but apparently it's not so much an issue of actual model year of 2026. Time will tell exactly, but that said, for the sake of efficiency, What Toyota has elected to do is say, scrap the whole idea with the short block. We're going to go with a long block exchange and possibly cab off. See, where it once was you pull the engine out the top, usually ricks, scratch, and body panels, a lot more invasive, and certainly it took a little more skill and sort of you had to learn your skills almost on the racetrack on how to extract an engine and pick an engine out of a chassis. The point is, between the 10-speed auto or that V6 engine, there was a lot of hardware to lift out through the front, like they've been doing for years, but the difference is now these new modern engines with all these extra intercooling and cooling system turbos, there's a lot more involved in these engines, a lot more to dismantle. So doing the old short blocks and tearing parts of it out the top or the entire thing long block through the top just meant a lot of extra labor. So now it looks like Toyota allegedly has sort of decided to move over and try something a little different. Cab off, it allows a 360 walk around to the entire engine and it gives them a better visibility, much cleaner in and out. And while there's more upfront labor involved in just getting the chassis off, the point is it's much easier to service that engine. Now, this is something we've heard from other brands. Let's be honest, Porsche, they've been dropping engines out the bottom for years. But you know what? We've been seeing this even in Ford and a lot of their diesels. They've lifted the cab off. It's way easier to do that just to access the drivetrain that's sitting right on top of the chassis. Well, it looks like it's Toyota's turn to deal with this. Now, the unfortunate part is, with almost encroaching on 130,000 recalls, the concept of metal particulate floating around, many experts are actually questioning, is that really the problem? When we're seeing a variation of different types of bearing failures, many consider that there's some sort of uneven stressors on the chassis of the case of the engine that could be contributing to uneven wear and possible stress distribution. Of course, ultimately, for lack of bumbling my words, causing extra stress and potential bearing failure. So before I tell you what exactly I'm feeling about this engine myself, there's a few key takeaways that are coming out of these inspections and, of course, these installations and procedures now on installing new engines and removing the old ones. Customers aren't having to wait as long. As a matter of fact, now there's consumers looking at possibly a turnaround in as little as 7 days. There's been a new technique with, improved supply chain, having more engines on stock and available. Of course, doing it in complete long block means it saves a ton of labor stripping all the parts off the top. Of course, on top of it, just having more technicians trained in that very extraction method means that, they're improving their learnings. Of course, they're also improving on the supply chain. And a lot of people that are going through this issue are now fortunately not having to wait months like they used to. This is something at least Toyota is learning along the way, but there are a few key takeaways. For example, one of them is the problem persists, but the scope is narrowed. With the V35A engine, machining debris, there's no longer really a mystery for 2026. It continues as more of a 2024-25 model year issue, reaching up to that 40 to 60,000 mile threshold. And statistically now, it's more of a mechanical variable and not so much an outlier. So take that for what it is, but ultimately it's still a problem for a lot of people. And there's no amount of coaching and coddling that you're going to make a customer who's dealing with their engine that just blew up make them feel any better. But anyhow, the other learning is the death of the short block rebuild. A major win for the 26 owners is the industry-wide, the switch over to the long blocks. That's another major win, and I just kind of talked about that. So that you're saving labor, you're saving time, and ultimately the turnaround time is much, much quicker. Another thing is logistically, the velocity is a standard. So standardizing that 7-day turnaround, I already mentioned that's another big finding. So Toyota has now found new procedures and methods to get that turned around much, much quicker. The other thing is the cab off precision. It's not only quicker, it's more precise. There's less like dropping that nut down the engine compartment. We've all done that working on our vehicles. All of a sudden you drop that 3/8 nut or that, that 10 mil nut or socket. And next thing you know, it's gone for life. You look at the bottom, it didn't follow through the bottom, but there it is. So it's more precise, less likely to have dropsies, less mistakes made. And by having the ability to just take the cab off, you're able to see all the way around it consistently, get two hands on the prize. And it's just definitely reducing the amount of errors in these rebuilds. On top of it, critical documentation. Now, they are saying it's very, very important. If you've missed any of your maintenance, you've missed on your oil changes, or you've sort of skipped on any of that maintenance, that could be a problem. So make sure you are taking care of your maintenance well in due time. Don't take this from me. Certainly follow your documentation. Me personally, outside of warranty especially, I'm doing more frequent oil changes. That said, I would follow this to the T. If it means qualifying for warranty, long block change or not, definitely follow it to the T. Make sure you do your research and find out very, very closely. That said, it's a very, very frustrating experience. Whether it's stress on the frame and the chassis of that engine, or whether it's they're producing too much horsepower now, and that extra strain isn't something that Toyota engines are accustomed to. Because let's be honest, it's always safer when you're producing a 200 horsepower engine than something closer to 400 horsepower, right? And sadly, a lot of times Toyotas, they don't build a lot of high power engines. They go with bigger, low turning. Even a lot of their older V8s maybe had a bit more power, but they were large lumps of V8 engines, turned slower, less stress. Their static compression ratios maybe weren't what they are today. Things, turbo engines, direct injection, they're subjecting these engines to more pressure. Things are changing. The industry is changing, and Toyota has been stumbling a little bit. Now, with that said, I love the product line. I love the LX600. I even love the GX550 even more. And I really am shopping for a truck these days because I need to haul around some of my toys from time to time. And I have been looking at the Tundra, but I keep coming around to circle back every single week. And I as much as I want a Tundra at this time, until I see definitively that there's 3 years in a row of no problems of the newer engines, then I can decisively say in my own mind that yes, I think they're out of the woods. But really, we're still talking about 23, 24, maybe 25s that still have these issues. So until I see 3 consecutive home run hits, I'm not buying. And the same thing goes with the Lexus products. Now, it's unfortunate because I love the GX550 and I was really, really looking at those. And the same thing stands true. When I see 3 consistent clean years that go by with no issues, then I think I'm sold. But for now, from my own personal take and the research I've been doing, I can't decipher whether we're dealing with rod bearing issues, whether they're doing main bearing issues, whether it's metal particulate, or whether it's a combination. Maybe it's a bad design, cooling, oiling, possibly a poor oiling condition. In my mind, that's where my mind goes. I don't know what the circumstance, and there's a lot smarter engineers over at Toyota than this cowboy, but I'll be honest. From my takeaway on this, I'm not sure, and I'm not sold yet. So until that day where I see a free run of quality, consistency, and no problems, and the long block replacement program goes away, I'm not sold. So as much as I love to get myself a new full-size Lexus SUV or a full-size Toyota truck, I just can't take that chance. And I don't know. You take your own chance. It's your money. You do with what you will. But at the end of the day, this here tells me, nope, I'm going to wait this one out. Because even looking for a truck, the problem is GM, they've struggled with the L87s and their 5.3s and their cylinder deactivation problems everywhere. Ford and a lot of their EcoBoost engines are struggling. The 3.5s aren't bad, but again, even the 5-liter in the wet belt, not perfect. And then we look over what's happening over at Ram. Their struggles are real too. They've been having no shortage of issues. The Hemi-Tech is still a thing. On top of it, you're still now dealing with the Hurricane, which many people are saying is actually pretty reliable. Again, time will tell. I know they have a good gearbox in the ZF 8-speed, but time will tell on that engine. So right now, I'm not very decisive on any half-ton full-size truck. The Tundra is certainly one of the bottom choices for me at this point until I hear otherwise in 3 good consecutive runs. Is it oiling? Is it metal particulate? Is it bad design or weak supply chain, maybe bearing issues? Not a whole lot has changed other than really the procedure at which they're changing these engines. That's why I personally would avoid these vehicles like the plague. Please do drop a line. If you are curious about Lexus, those are the vehicles I would buy from Lexus, and those are the only Toyotas I would buy currently right now. Hope to see each and every one of you real soon, everybody. Talk to you then. Bye-bye.